Welcome back. Our quest to tame paper fog continues with episode 3, no less. Which means that there has already been episode 1 and episode 2, so go watch those if you haven't already. It will help fill in the gaps in this episode and provide necessary context. With that out of the way, let's turn to the main character of today's episode, Lith printing. I'm Leo Nikishin, this is 10 Rolls of Film. Let's do this. Couple of things to mention before we dive in. First, there is a fundamental difference in approach between the solutions that we looked at in previous episodes and Lith printing. Because you see, restrainer and bleach are meant to reduce or hopefully even eliminate paper fog, but that's basically all we want from them in this case. And the less influence they have on other properties of our print, the better. We don't want them to have any noticeable influence on contrast or tone of our paper or things like that. And that's where Lith printing is different, because it is not neutral by design. And whichever way you apply it, it will produce a print that is different from a, let's call it a conventional print. It will have a different tone, it will have different grain, different contrast, most likely. And that's something to keep in mind. So if you think of restrainer and bleach as strictly steps towards achieving the results comparable to fresh paper, then Lith printing is more of a side-forward step. 2. Lith printing is much more than just a solution for making fogged paper usable. It's a fully fledged alternative technique with lots of variables, lots of creative control, and this video is by no means a primer or a guide to Lith printing. I encourage you, by all means, look up more resources on that. There are some videos, there are some books. There is a fantastic book by Tim Rodman, which is probably the best sort of complete guide to Lith printing out there. Unfortunately, it's been out of print for quite some time now, and it's notoriously difficult to find and expensive when it does pop up, but something to keep an eye out for. So this video will only look at the basics of Lith printing and how it works with fogged paper. First thing you need to know about Lith printing is that it relies on a chemical process called infectious development. And no need to reach out for that hazmat suit. It won't infect you. But it is a really unique process, so here is a significantly oversimplified explanation. The one and only developing agent in any Lith developer formula is hydroquinone. And there's nothing particularly special about that. It's one of the most popular developing agents out there, and it is used in some of the most popular and iconic film and paper developers of all time, like D76 and HC110. But you see, hydroquinone by itself is a rather slow-working agent, and it is usually paired with either an accelerator or another developing agent, which is a bit more enthusiastic. And many popular developers actually do both, an accelerator and another developing agent. Not so in a Lith developer. Here, hydroquinone does all the work by itself, sad and slow, with no bodies to cheer it up, developing only very thin densities like highlights and upper midtones at a very relaxed rate, so slow, oh my god. Fun fact, fun, maybe nerdy fact, okay. In this scenario, hydroquinone actually starts working more as a staining developer, and that will become important later. But as hydroquinone eventually becomes exhausted and oxidized, it starts leaving behind a byproduct known as semiquinone, and that fella happens to be a really potent developing agent. It may take anywhere between 5 and 15 minutes or so, but once enough semiquinone builds up in the developing solution, the development process switches gears and floors it, quickly darkening the shadows and then proceeding quite rapidly to midtones and even highlights if you're not careful. And you really have to watch the shadow areas in which you want to have some detail left and pull out the print from the developing solution before those areas turn black. The moment when you pull the sheet of paper out of the developing solution is called snatch point, and it's very important, and there is no solid rule as to when that has to happen. Essentially, we end up with a two-stage developer in one solution. First, the highlights and midtones get developed by the slow-working hydroquinone, and then the shadows get developed by a fast-working semiquinone. And as you may have guessed already, it's this dual nature of Lith development that provides a solution for paper fog. Because you see, as we discovered in previous episodes, paper fog affects the highlights the most. But in a Lith developer, those highlights only get developed by a very slow-working, sad hydroquinone all by itself. And those additional densities from fogging either don't get developed at all, or they get toned or stained into some sort of hue, some sort of non-white, non-neutral tone. See, that's where the staining nature of very slow hydroquinone development plays a role. On top of that, Lith developer actually also contains a hearty dose of our fog-fighting buddy from the first episode, potassium bromide. On the print exposure side, the main difference compared to a conventional print is that we need to overexpose our paper. If you're printing a negative that you have printed before conventionally and you know exposure time for it, then overexposing by about 3 stops will probably get you in the ballpark. You may have to adjust from there, but it tends to be a good starting point. So either by opening up the aperture or by extending the exposure time, off you go. Keep in mind that Lith development renders contrast filtration and even the fixed contrast of graded papers pretty much irrelevant. So print with white light. You will need as much light as you can get for those extra 3 stops of exposure, trust me. So print with white light, all filters removed or dialed down to 0, and by extension, as you can imagine, split grade technique is not applicable here either. Since filtration does not affect contrast, we get another way of controlling it. In simple terms, your exposure controls the highlights. More exposure will lead to more intensely toned and less brilliant highlights, while shorter exposure will keep the highlights more brilliant and more neutral in tone. And then the shadows are controlled by development. And it's your timing of snatch point in particular that will define where your black point is, how much clipping there is in the shadows, and so on. One distinct feature of Lith prints is grain, or grains, plural. That's because the highlights and midtones tend to get fine, normal grain from development in hydroquinone, but the shadows get this very chunky, very coarse grain from being developed in semiquinone. And these really grainy shadows may look a little bit unsettling at first, but rest assured, it's a feature, not a bug. Finally, there's the issue of the paper itself. Different photographic papers will react to Lith development differently, and some may not be suitable for it at all. That's because the main enemy of Lith development is a developer built into the paper emulsion. And unfortunately, that rules out quite a lot of papers produced today, most notably the very popular Ilford multigrade series, FOMA Brom and FOMA Speed series, stuff like that. Some of the most popular stuff they're making these days. But unfortunately, that's the case. And it's easy to see why. Because if there is a developer built into the paper emulsion, then it will try to lend a hand to the hydroquinone during development, and there will be no oxidation. There will be no oxidation, there will be no build-up of semiquinone, no infectious development, none of that yummy stuff. So if you want to use fresh papers, there are some papers produced today that don't have developer built into them. and I suggest you go for those. If you're using expired paper, then things are a bit less clear-cut, because even if the paper had the developer built into it back in the day, chances are that the developer has exhausted since, and you really need to test every pack individually to see what's what. And of course, prior to, I'm guessing, late 1970s, pretty much all papers produced before that didn't have developer built into them, so those are good to go in any case. So let's look at our test prints and see where Lith printing gets us. Firstly, to recap, this is our reference sheet. The paper is AGFA MCP 312. It's resin coated, multi-contrast or variable contrast paper, produced sometime in the 90s, we can't say for sure. And this is as white and neutral as it can possibly get, because the reference sheet went straight from the paper pack into the fixer, so it wasn't exposed to light, it wasn't developed at all. This is our reference. And this is a straight print of my test negative on this paper. So as you can see, it was pretty severely fogged, not usable at all. So then our next step was to use a restrainer, and this is the best I could do with a restrainer right here. It's 20 milliliters of restrainer and a higher contrast filtration. Then we used ferricyanide bleach in addition to restrainer, and as you can see, it's quite a significant improvement here. And finally, the hero of today's episode, this is the Lith print. Same negative, same paper. It is 3 stops more exposure here. And well, first of all, clearly it is a very different tone. But if someone showed this to me, I honestly wouldn't have guessed that it was printed on a severely fogged paper. I guess I could have made a print with a touch less overexposure for a slightly more neutral tone, and maybe pull it out of the developer a little bit earlier, because the left side of the boat here is going a little bit darker than I would like. But all in all, it's a pretty good result. I'm impressed. So, sounds pretty great so far, doesn't it? And indeed, it does. But just like restrainer and bleach, Lith printing does have some limitations. First off, there is the issue of frugality, or lack thereof. Typically, Lith developers are sold, and also mixed if you're making your own, as 2 stock solutions, solution A and solution B. And then you mix those 2 with water to make working solution just before the printing session. And the stock solutions make it really well. I'm using the Moesh solution, and it should be good for about 2 years from opening. But the working solution has an extremely short shelf life. Actually, I wouldn't even call it shelf life. It's more of a tray life, because realistically, you're only going to use it for 1 session only. It lasts about 8 hours in an open tray. Maybe a little bit different if you have a lid on, but that's the ballpark. And there's a very simple explanation as to why the shelf life or tray life is so abysmal. It's because Lith developers simply cannot have the same amount of preservatives and antioxidants that a normal developer has, because if there are antioxidants, how is the oxidation process supposed to happen? So, the non-existent tray and shelf life is the price we have to pay for the very special chemical process that we're using here. Lith developer also exhausts quite a bit faster than a conventional developer, and also every next sheet you develop adds a little bit more potassium bromide, which helps fight paper fog, but also slows down the development. So your development times will get longer progressively as your printing session goes on and you develop more and more paper in the same working solution. And really, combined with a short tray/shelf life, this quick exhaustion makes achieving consistent, repeatable results not impossible, but definitely trickier than with conventional development. You definitely need to keep better notes and note which sheet in your session a particular print was that you want to replicate, so that you can sort of plan for that. To add insult to the injury, Lith developers also aren't particularly cheap. If you are more proficient at making your own chemicals than I am, then you should absolutely consider Googling formulas. They seem to be not particularly difficult to make because commercial solutions are not cheap. But probably the biggest issue with Lith is not lack of frugality or expense. No, it's the artistic, expressive qualities of the prints that it produces. As I mentioned at the beginning, Lith printing is not a neutral technique. It has a very distinct look, very distinct style, and that may suit some subjects and some shots and some compositions extremely well. I've seen some really spectacular results with Lith, but it might also look very sort of out of place and incoherent with some other shots. So while it is a very exciting addition to our palette as printers and as photographers, it's definitely not a one-size-fits-all kind of solution. So there you have it. For me personally, Lith printing has been the most practical and artistically rewarding way of utilizing fogged paper. It is as good at eliminating or hiding paper fog as the combination of bleach and restrainer, but it is a lot easier to use because there are no additional baths, no fixing, no extra wash, none of that stuff. Also, unlike ferricyanide bleach from our previous episode, Lith printing does not involve any particularly harmful chemicals. The usual wisdom of not bathing in the solution or drinking it applies here as well, but still, it's even potentially it's less dangerous. Yes, the developer itself is a bit expensive, and yes, shelf life is non-existent, but you can more than make up for that expense by using expired paper, which is often thrown in for free or for very close to free with other photographic stuff. By the way, if you make a Lith print and you like everything about it except for that very distinct Lith tone, you can actually fix that. You can bleach the Lith print with the ferricyanide bleach from our previous episode and then redevelop the print in a conventional developer of your choice. And everything will stay the same in terms of grain, contrast, and so on, but the tone will be a lot more neutral. So, there's even a fix for that if you so prefer. That's it for this episode. If you liked it and found it useful, please consider giving it a thumbs up and subscribing to the channel. There will be a lot more videos on film photography, darkroom printing, all that other yummy cool stuff. And thanks so much to my current subscribers. I was really touched by the response to the previous episodes and the comments. I really appreciate it. And as always, thanks for watching.